We, meaning Jim Fowler, Don Brzezinski, Stan Wujek, and Greta Wujek, took a trip to Greece and Turkey with Pilgrim Tours from February 22 to March 6, 2019. I, Jim, have prepared two different slideshows, one of our travels in Greece and another of our travels in Turkey. And so this is the title slide beginning the slideshow of photos illustrating the highlights of our visit to Greece, visiting the cities that Paul visited in the first century. This slide shows the geography of modern Greece. Notice the Peloponnesian Peninsula that was sometimes referred to as the area of Achaia or Achaia. The mainland of Greece is far more mountainous terrain than some might imagine, and in the northern part includes the region known as Macedonia, even though there's a small country now named Macedonia just to the north of Greece. In addition to the Peloponnese and the mainland Greece, there are also many islands that proceed to the east in the Aegean Sea, even over near the coast of Turkey. On the west of Greece is the Adriatic Sea that extends over to Italy. One cannot understand the history and archaeological remains of Greece without some realization of the Greek people's imaginative mythological superstitions by which they attempted to explain the origins of all things, as well as their alleged influence on all features of Greek life. The Theogony of Hesiod, dating to 700 BC, first outlined many of the myths, filled in by Homer's poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The mythological creatures, both persons and objects, were thought to begin with chaos, nothingness, bringing forth Gaia, earth, Eros, love, Erebus, shadow and darkness, and Tartarus, the abyss and torture. These mythological creatures were often regarded as gods or goddesses, especially the 12 gods thought to reside on Mount Olympus. Zeus was considered to be the head of these gods, with 4 alleged siblings, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and Hestia. 6 children were hypothesized, twins, Artemis and Apollo, along with Athena, Hermes, Ares, and Aphrodite. It should be noted that while the Greek gods and goddesses were not infinite and were thought of as quite localized, they were at least regarded as personal polytheistic gods who engaged in all kinds of shenanigans, including sexual liaisons and murder. These 12 Olympian gods and goddesses in the Greek pantheon were crafted in sculptures at the very top of the Parthenon in Athens in the 5th century BC. It will be helpful if we look at the Greek history and divide it into various time periods. First, there was ancient Greece from approximately 1100 to 146 BC, and many of the archaeological ruins that we will view in Greece date back to ancient Greece. Now we come to Roman Greece from 146 to 324 AD. This is the biblical period of Paul's journeys that we're exploring on this trip will fall within this period. Then we have Byzantine Greece from AD 324 to 1456. There will also be some archaeological objects from the Byzantine period that we will see. There's Ottoman Greece from AD 1453 to 1821, and modern Greece from 1821 AD to the present. We're going to begin the itinerary of our travelogue in Corinth, located on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, just across the narrow Isthmus of Corinth. The isthmus is approximately 4 miles wide, and by the way, the word isthmus is the Greek word for neck, and it's the narrow stretch of land between two larger land masses. Canals are often constructed across isthmuses to connect the bodies of water on each side. Think, for example, of the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal. Now, such a canal was proposed in the period of ancient Greece, centuries before Christ, and was attempted in the 1st century A.D. by the Emperor Nero of Rome. That would be about A.D. 67. But all attempts were unsuccessful until the 19th century, when such a canal connecting the Gulf of Corinth and the Saronic Gulf was constructed. Now, such a canal over this isthmus was necessitated by the treacherous seas around the south of the Peloponnese, causing the loss of many ships with their crews and goods coming from both east and west. We can testify of those winds because when we were in Athens and Corinth, the winds were almost 50 miles an hour from the north, and it would certainly have caused havoc with ships going south of the Peloponnese. The history of Corinth is punctuated by various geographical and historical circumstances. It was in a strategic geographical and commercial location, with the port of Lachaia on the north on the Gulf of Corinth, and the port of Cenchreae to the south on the Saronic Gulf. Ships would put in and offload their goods and transport them across the 4-mile isthmus. And so the city of Corinth was a sailor town and a commercial location. It developed a reputation for debauchery, for drunkenness and prostitution. There was even a verb to Corinthianize, i.e., to engage in illicit behavior. Whenever a Corinthian was cast in a Greek drama, that person was inevitably a drunk or a prostitute. The town of Corinth was overshadowed by a huge acropolis, which means high city, on a huge rock just a few miles south of the town. And on the top of that rock there was a temple to the Greek goddess Aphrodite, reputed to have had as many as 1,000 prostitutes to service the sailors and other visitors. Corinth and its Acropolis were destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. Portions of the ancient Greek temple of the god Apollo were, however, left standing and exist to this day. 100 years later, Julius Caesar authorized the rebuilding of the city of Corinth. Much money was expended, and Corinth was designated as a Roman colony. It was to enjoy all the privileges of any city in Italy, including Roman justice. So most of what the Apostle Paul saw when he visited around the middle of the 1st century A.D. would have been the new construction of the Romans, and he was also the recipient of Roman justice. As previously noted, there were numerous proposals and attempts to construct a canal across the Corinthian isthmus, but it did not transpire until the 19th century A.D. And we should note that it was Paul who introduced the Christian gospel to the town of Corinth on his second missionary journey, as recorded in Acts 15:36 through 18:22. To transport goods across the Corinthian isthmus prior to the canal, the diolkos, meaning to haul or carry through, was constructed between the northern and southern ports. It was a roadway or carriageway upon which trolleys were used to haul the goods from the ships between the ports, and portions of the old dialkos still remain. The dialkos was located in roughly the same area as the present canal, and may have even hauled smaller ships the 4 miles across the isthmus as this drawing represents. The Corinthian Canal was finally constructed in 1882 to 1892 and can be seen as it exists today in these aerial photos. It must be an interesting journey to be pulled through the tall rock walls of the Corinthian Canal by a tug, as is seen in this photo. The Apostle Paul visited Corinth on his second missionary journey in the middle of the 1st century A.D. He began, as you see over on the right side of the map, he began in Antioch of Syria, traveled to his hometown of Tarsus, and on to Derbe, Iconium, and Lystra in southern Galatia, and then to Antioch of Pisidia. He wanted to go north, but the door was closed. So he answered the Macedonian call to go to Europe by going to Troas and sailing to Neapolis and then walking over the mountains to Philippi. From there he went to Thessalonica, Berea, down to Athens, and over to Corinth. Our tour itinerary was to travel the cities visited by Paul in reverse order. After 1.5 years in Corinth, Paul sailed from the port of Cenchreae across the Aegean Sea to Ephesus, and then on to Rhodes, Patara, and down to Caesarea Maritima, Jerusalem, and finally back to Antioch. Now, this slide was going to look the same, but it's the third missionary journey, and it was sometime after the second that Paul traveled, as recorded in Acts 18:23 to 21:16, from Antioch to his hometown Tarsus, on to Derbe, Iconium, Lystra, and Antioch of Pisidia, and on to Ephesus, where he spent 3 years. From there he sailed to Troas, across to Neapolis, and walked to Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea, before returning to Athens, and then visiting the struggling and contentious church in Corinth. This slide shows the archaeological ruins of Corinth and the Acropolis in the background. As you can see, the archaeological ruins are quite extensive in Corinth. Here's a map showing the archaeological ruins. Some of the highlights are the Roman theater and the nearby Odeon, or music hall. It was in this area that they discovered what we're going to see in just a moment, the Erastus inscription. Now, the ancient Greek temple of Apollo is the oldest of the ruins, comes from the ancient Greek era, and stands out because of its size. The Lechi-Ion Road runs north from the town to the port of the same name, and there was a propylon, that is a large gateway monument, at the south end of that street. The Peirene fountain was next to the gate, and there were many shops that lined this main boulevard. There was another shopping area to the north. The Agora, meaning the public forum or town square where people milled around and socialized, had shops along the south side, as well as an elevated platform called the Bema Rock, where speeches and announcements could be made. Behind this area was a stoa, which is a covered area where people could gather. There was also another stoa near the Temple of Apollo. To the west of the Agora were more shops and steps that went up to the imperial temple of Octavia, the Roman empress, who reigned at the time that Paul visited Corinth. The worship of the Roman emperor existed alongside the worship of the mythological Greek gods. Standing out amongst the ruins of Corinth is the ancient Greek temple of Apollo. Greek temples had steps ascending from all four sides, whereas Roman temples usually had steps ascending from only one side. The inset shows a statue of Apollo, even though it was not discovered in Corinth. When looking at the map, we noted that the inscription of Erastus was found near the theater. Prior to the discovery of this inscription, there was no documentation of this person that Paul mentioned in Corinth, both in the epistle to the Romans and in his epistle to Timothy. The inscription was unearthed in 1929. It's dated back to the middle of the 1st century AD, and it reads in Latin, Erastus, in return for his maintenance of public buildings, paved this area at his own expense. The fountain of Peirene was located near the gateway of Lycaon Road. The spring of Peirene was at the top of the Acropolis. With the Acropolis in the background, we now see the area to the south of the public gathering square called the Agora. As I've said, the Agora was the town square where the public gathered, and the Bema platform was a raised platform where orators spoke. A small sign identifies this as the Bema. And this is biblically important, for while Paul was in Corinth, recorded in Acts 18, verses 12 to 17, he was brought before Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia, or the Peloponnese, likely at this very location, this very Bema platform. And he was charged with sedition for encouraging people to worship the one God rather than the Greek gods or the imperial gods. In the utmost of expedience, Gallio indicated that this was not a legitimate legal issue, and he dismissed the case. But notice the whipping post for the punishment of public flogging in front of the Bema. This photo has Jim Fowler posing at the whipping post. Inside the Corinth Archaeological Museum, which is located within the town ruins, are some sculptures of unidentified persons, presumably from Corinth. To the north of the theater in Corinth was the temple of Asklepius, who was the Greek god of healing. The sculpture in the inset is a representation of Asklepius from another location. You will notice the snake coiled around the stick. Within the Archaeology Museum in Corinth, there are many terracotta human body parts, and these were objects carried into the temple of Asklepius to identify what portion of the worshipper's body needed to be healed. Apparently, Asklepius was not omniscient or all-knowing. Proceeding up to the 2,000-foot Acropolis, we see the massive gateway to the Acropolis. There was actually 3 gates, but the whole construct there was not made until the 13th or 14th century. You can see that it was a huge fortress constructed in the Byzantine era. Here is a map drawing of the archaeological ruins at the top of the Corinth Acropolis, or what's often called the Acro-Corinth. Going through the 3 gates, the foremost features are the keep, which was the huge tower of the fortress, and the remains of the temple of Aphrodite, which we've indicated was reported by Strabo as employing up to 1,000 prostitutes. The inset is a statue of Aphrodite from another location. And this is all that remains of the temple of Aphrodite on the top of the Corinth Acropolis today, looking to the south. To the southeast of the city of Corinth was the southern port of Cenchrea, now called Chytris. Paul sailed from this port on his second missionary journey, Acts 18:18, and mentions this location in Romans 16:1 when he commends Phoebe as a servant or minister of the church at Cenchrea. So now, traveling the approximately 60 miles east along the rugged coastline, we continued our journey in Athens, the capital city of modern Greece. The history of Athens parallels that of Greece as a whole, but we've divided the history into these particular periods. The classical Athens in antiquity from antiquity to 338 BC. Hellenistic Athens from 338 to 85 BC. Roman Athens from 85 BC to AD 267. Byzantine Athens from AD 267 to 1204. Latin Athens from AD 1205 to 1458. Ottoman Athens from AD 1458 to 1821, and modern Athens beginning in AD 1821 to the present. Let me note that many of the archaeological ruins that we see in Athens date to the earliest period, classical period of the history of Athens. The Parthenon, the Propylaea Gateway, the Erechtheion, the Theater of Dionysius, etc., all date to the 5th century BC. Paul, on the other hand, would have visited Athens during the Roman period. At the Greece National Academy of Research in Athens, there are statues of the early Greek philosophers Plato and his teacher Socrates. These philosophers also lived in the early classical period of Athens. The National Archaeology Museum is a must-see in order to get a comprehensive understanding of Greek history. It contains archaeological artifacts from all the eras and all the geographical areas of Greece. Don Brzezinski and I went to Athens a day early to see this museum. The new Acropolis Museum is a recent structure built to highlight the archaeological remains discovered on top of the Athenian Acropolis. The high place of the old city of Athens is the Acropolis, which means high city. And the highlight of the archaeological remains on the Acropolis is the Parthenon, the temple of Athena the Virgin. The Parthenon was named after Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin. This map, it's a drawing of what remains on the top and around the Acropolis, and it shows the massive Propylaea, which was the gateway monument, the temple of Athena Nike nearby, the Erechtheion, which was a temple of both Athena and Poseidon, and the Parthenon temple of Athena the Virgin, as well as you can see toward the bottom and to the right, the Theater of Dionysius, who was the god of wine, the large stoa, which was the covered area near the agora, the Odeon music theater of Herod Atticus, which dates much later in the Roman period. But this gives us an orientation of what we were seeing on top of the Acropolis. Here we have an artist's rendering of what the Athens Acropolis complex would have looked like in its heyday in the classical period. And this is another rendering of the archaeological ruins that now exist on the Athens Acropolis. The standout on the Acropolis is, of course, the Parthenon, the temple of Athena the Virgin, constructed between 447 and 438 BC, a magnificently engineered structure, and perhaps the supreme example of Doric architecture. And you will notice that as a Greek temple, it has ascending steps on all four sides. The gold-laden statue of the Greek goddess Athena was located in the Parthenon temple. But this statue is simply a reproduction of what the Athena statue likely looked like. This photo is of the much taller temple of Athena the Victor, located near the gateway entrance to the Acropolis. The Erechtheion is a temple constructed in 420 to 406 BC to commemorate the mythical battle between Athena, the protector of cities, and Poseidon, the god of the sea. Athena is alleged to have won the battle, and the city was therefore called Athens. The Porch of the Maidens is appended to the Erechtheion with standing female columns called caryatids. It is a Greek word meaning maidens of Carii, which was an ancient town of the Peloponnese. The massive Propylaea Gateway to the Acropolis was constructed in 437 BC and is presently in the process of reconstruction. The Odeon Music Hall of Herodotus Atticus was built in AD 161. That's in the Roman period, and it would not have been present when Paul visited the city of Athens on both his second and third missionary journeys. It was restored in the 1950s and is still used today for musical events seating 5,000 people. The theater of Dionysius, the god of wine and drama, was perhaps the first large theater ever built in the classical period of the 5th century BC. It was able to seat up to 17,000 people. The Agora was the city square, the public forum where people gathered for public discourse. And this is probably where the grand experiment of ancient Athenian democracy was conceived and first implemented in the classical period of Athenian history. Paul would no doubt have wandered in this area as he awaited the arrival of Silas and Timothy from Berea. In Acts 17:17, we find on the record that he was reasoning with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks every day in the Agora. And this is where he encountered the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers who eventually took him to the Areopagus for further discussion. The Stoa of Attalus was the covered porch area that extended the Agora, and it was constructed here between 1952 and 1956, and the Museum of the Ancient Agora is housed in the Stoa today. The biblical record indicates that Paul visited Athens, and here are the references. Now those who escorted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they left. Later, Acts 17:16. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing a city full of idols. And then in Acts 17:22, after Paul was up on the Areopagus, we read, "So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious.'" And the Greek word for religious is desdaimonia, which means great respect for demons. And then Acts 18:1, after these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. The philosophers of Athens took Paul up to the Areopagus for further discussion. It was a large rock outcropping seen here from atop the Acropolis. Areopagus means the rock of Ares, and Ares was the Greek god of war. But it was also known as Mars Hill, because Mars was the Roman god of war. And it was on the Areopagus that Paul preached his sermon about Jesus and the resurrection, and he pointed out that he had seen an idol dedicated to an unknown God. Paul believed that behind every false idol was a diabolic demon. That is also indicated in 1 Corinthians 8, 1-10. See, Paul saw through the Greek mythology and the pantheon of gods, and he called it like it was. And such cultural offense got him into trouble. Later in Ephesus, they charged him with saying, "Gods made with hands are no gods at all," Acts 19:26, and a riot almost ensued. Here we see Areopagus, as it can be seen from the Acropolis. And it's thrilling to climb the ancient steps up to the Areopagus, knowing that these were likely, at least some of these steps, were likely the very steps that Paul would have climbed almost 2,000 years ago to visit with the philosophers. From the Areopagus outcropping, one can see over to the ecclesia rock outcropping, where the Athenians gathered during the classical period to democratically discuss public affairs. The Greek word ecclesia means gathering or assembly. And as it occurs in our New Testaments, it was translated, whether rightly or wrongly, as church. Because church, ecclesia, is those who are called out. Here we have an artistic rendering of the ecclesia public assembly in early Greek democracy. The people gathered, there was this bema platform where people could stand up and speak, and they were called out for the public good, a discussion of the public good of the community, and those who refused to come to discuss the public good were referred to as the idiotes. Yes, you know the English word derived from such. Now we continue our journey in Greece to the location of Delphi. This is not a biblical site connected with Paul, but it is essential to understanding how the Greek people thought before, during, and after Paul. We see here an artist's rendering of the physical complex of buildings in Delphi. Delphi was located on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, about 200 kilometers, 120 miles from Athens. And it was thought to be a sacred spring at the site. The Oracle of Delphi was well known throughout the ancient world. The high priestess, called Pythia, from the snake god Python, that Apollo had allegedly killed, operated within the temple of Apollo. and the Pythia, the high priestess of Delphi, served as the renowned oracle, giving cryptic predictions of future occurrences. You see, the oracle referred to both the priestess and the proclamation that was delivered. And many sought her fortune-telling oracles and regarded Delphi to be the spiritual navel, the center point of the world. It's here again that we see the imaginative, mythological idolatry of the peoples to whom Paul was bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ. The temple of Apollo was the focal point of Delphi. Apollo was regarded as the god of the sun, moon, and light, as well as truth and prophecy. These mythological gods could be ascribed with any kind of virtues. It was from the temple of Apollo that the Pythia, high priestess, would pontificate her cryptic fortune-telling predictions of what was to happen, and they came from around the world to hear such. Here's a drawing of the oracle, the Pythia, allegedly receiving revelations from the gods, but likely in a drug-crazed trance. There was also a temple of Athena at Delphi, the goddess of wisdom and inspiration and courage, among other things. Here is a drawing of the theater at Delphi, with the large temple of Apollo at the base of the theater. And here we see the ruins of the same theater and temple of Apollo as they exist today. This is a photo of the exterior of the Delphi Archaeological Museum, and some of the more important objects in the Delphi Museum are the ancient bronze statue of a Greek charioteer, which was found at Delphi, and the Sphinx of Naxos, erected on a column next to the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. But the primary object of biblical interest in the museum at Delphi is this inscription. A letter from Emperor Claudius in AD 52, mentioning Gallio, the proconsul, who dismissed charges against Paul back in Acts 18, 12 to 18. Prior to this inscription being found, many scholars questioned the accuracy of Luke's reference to Gallio as the Roman proconsul in Corinth. But when this inscription was found, that answered all those questions. Our tour proceeded north from Delphi to Meteora, another location that really has no direct correlation with the visits of the Apostle Paul in Greece. What we have in Meteora are Greek Orthodox monasteries constructed on limestone pillars. The word Meteora means high or lofty, and of course is related to the word meteor. There were originally 24 such monasteries, but now there are only 6 operative religious communities. They were first constructed in the 14th century AD to withdraw from the world, to be close to God, and to avoid Turkish invaders. The first monastery at Meteora was started by monks from Mount Athos, which is the foremost Greek Orthodox reclusive community. As you can see, these monasteries were precariously perched high on the rocks, and access was limited to ladders and pulley systems. Only much later were stairways constructed. In some of the monasteries, they have kept the skulls of their brothers of the past, thus commemorating the church through the ages. Some would consider this grotesque or macabre, but it's a legitimate way to recognize the fellowship with all Christians through the ages. Within these monasteries, there is an abundance of beautiful, iconic artwork, and this is very common amongst the Eastern Orthodox churches, to have artistic representation of biblical personages and those regarded as saints in the history of the church. The sanctuaries in the monastery chapels are very ornate and adorned with numerous iconic representations that serve as teaching tools. One of the purposes of the construction of these elevated and hard-to-reach monasteries was to get close to God in an ascetic manner that abstained from all worldly sensual pleasures. From Meteora, we move on to Berea. It's now a modern day, it's called Berea, where Paul visited, as recorded in Acts 17, verses 10 to 14, that after escaping from a mob in Thessalonica. There's nothing much of biblical archaeological interest in Berea today, but a monument has been constructed commemorating Paul's visit to Berea. The monument has beautiful mosaic art that portrays how the Bereans received the word with eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things that Paul was preaching were actually so. Acts 17, verse 11. We also visited a Jewish synagogue that survived the Nazi desecration of all things Jewish throughout Greece in World War II. From Berea, we traveled east to Thessaloniki, Thessalonica, and there are limited archaeological ruins in an area in the downtown area of the modern city. This is a photo of some shops, likely from the Roman period when Paul visited, and he probably saw these in Thessalonica. Here we see a small theater that was undoubtedly present in Thessalonica when Paul visited there. This map of northern Greece shows the old Roman road that went east from Thessalonica to Philippi, and notice that it is identified as the Via Egnatia. The Via Egnatia was a Roman road from Turkey in the east over to the Adriatic Sea in the west, across the region known as Macedonia. It was named after the Roman proconsul Gnaeus Egnatius, who ordered its construction in the 2nd century BC. Paul would therefore have walked this road in Macedonia in the middle of the 1st century. The Via Ignatius ran alongside the Agora in the city of Philippi, as pictured here. And the archaeological ruins in Philippi are quite extensive. Okay, this is an overview of the archaeological ruins, and one can see the Agora, which probably had a bema platform or stone for oratory and justice. And Paul, along with Silas, were likely there when the magistrates of Philippi ordered them beaten with rods and thrown into prison. Later, when they were to be released, Paul played his trump card, identifying he and Silas as Roman citizens who were not to be subjected to such street justice. The magistrates were afraid of having violated the laws of Roman justice, and they appealed to Paul and Silas to please leave town. This picture was taken from the top of the Roman theater in Philippi. You will see in the far background the Christian basilica from the later centuries in Philippi. This is a closer photo showing the Philippian agora, or public forum, where Paul would have been engaged in preaching. And this is an aerial view of the Roman theater in Philippi. Here we see the ruins of a Christian basilica or church constructed in Philippi sometime from the 4th to the 6th century AD. Scripture records that Lydia, a seller of purple material from Thyatira, was the first Christian convert in Europe. She was baptized in a river outside of Philippi, recorded in Acts 16:13-15, and a church of St. Lydia has been constructed along the river to the east of Philippi, and it contains some beautiful mosaics of biblical scenes, as do most Greek Orthodox churches. A few steps away by the river, we find a baptistry that's been constructed in the proximity of the location where Lydia was baptized. Neapolis, just over the mountain to the south of Philippi, was the port where Paul and Silas first landed on European soil. The town is now called Kavala. This map illustrates the northern part of the Aegean Sea, picturing the locations mentioned in Scripture for the introduction of the Christian gospel to the European continent. In Acts 16:1-10, we find the record of the Macedonian call that Paul received in a vision of a man appealing someone to come and preach to them. And in Acts 16:11-13, we read, "So putting out to sea from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and on the day following to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia. We went outside the gate to a riverside, where we were supposing that there would be a place of prayer. And we sat down and began speaking to the women who had assembled. And so it is that the Christian gospel spread to Europe." As mentioned earlier, we traced Paul's steps through Greece in reverse from the original course on the second missionary journey. He started in Philippi and went to Corinth. We started in Corinth and ended in Philippi. This is the first in a series of 2 slideshow videos of a combined trip to Greece and Turkey in 2019. The second is entitled A Visit to Turkey and the Cities of the Revelation. And this slideshow was compiled and narrated by Jim Fowler of Christ in You Ministries.